I'm Sahal Reed, Senior Attorney in Medmarc's Risk Management Department, and I would like to welcome you to Medmarc's Risk Management video series on clinical trials. Part 1 of this series will provide you with an overview of the clinical trial process, which will address questions like, does my product require clinical testing in order to be approved by the FDA? And what are the phases of a clinical trial? Subsequent videos will delve deeper into the clinical trial process and will look at subjects such as the product's liability implications of clinical trials, informed consent, clinical trial agreements, IRB oversight, the clinical trial approval process in the UK, Canada, and the EU, and the importance of participant group diversity and clinical trial enrollment. First off, what are clinical trials and why do they matter? Per the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, clinical trials, also known as clinical studies, test potential treatments in human volunteers to see whether they should be approved for wider use in the general population. A treatment could be a drug, a medical device, or biologic, such as a vaccine, blood product, or gene therapy. Now, clinical trials are meant to establish the safety and efficacy of a drug, device, or biologic. These studies are generally initiated by a sponsor. The sponsor is an individual or organization, such as a medical device or drug company, which is responsible for the clinical trial. The sponsor will develop the protocol for the clinical trial, which outlines the key parameters of the study. When are clinical trials required? Note that clinical trials are not always required in order to bring a product to market. Clinical trials are needed for new drugs, devices, and biologics, or for new uses of a product already on the market. If you do need to run a human clinical trial, you will need to submit satisfactory information from preclinical or animal studies to the FDA prior to commencing your human clinical trial. If you are in the United States, your human clinical trials will be regulated by the FDA. In Canada, it will be regulated by Health Canada. In the United Kingdom, it will be regulated by the Medicines and Healthcare Products Regulatory Agency, otherwise known as the MHRA. And for EU member states, clinical trial oversight is the responsibility of individual EU member states. However, as of January 2022, EU member states and European Economic Area countries have moved towards increased harmonization, bringing greater efficiencies and alignment of regulatory requirements to clinical trials being conducted in Europe. What are the phases of a clinical trial? If your product is a drug, you may need to conduct preclinical studies and research to demonstrate that your product is safe for study in humans. These early studies are not usually very complicated or large. However, they should provide the FDA with the relevant facts and details on dosing and toxicity for human subjects. Specifically, they should provide some information on the pharmacokinetic and pharmacodynamics of the drug. Preclinical studies can involve human microdose studies, animal testing, and research conducted with statistical analysis software. Moreover, prior to commencing clinical trials, the sponsor needs to file an investigational new drug application or investigational device exemption, requesting permission from FDA to conduct the trial. We will speak further about investigational applications, IRBs, and informed consent in subsequent videos. Phase 1 of your clinical trial for your drug product will begin upon approval of your investigational application from the FDA. Phase 1 clinical trials involve a small group of healthy study participants to determine safety and effective dosage. Prior to beginning Phase 1, you will need to engage in recruitment of study participants. You will need to have clearly laid out the exclusion and inclusion criteria in the study protocol because this can be an area fraught with risk. Note the primary focus of Phase 1 is to determine the safety of your product. Phase 2. The primary focus of phase 2 clinical trials is to determine the effectiveness of your product. You will enroll a larger group of study participants in phase 2 than you did for your phase 1 study to see if your drug is effective in study participants with a particular illness. Phase 3. Phase 3 moves you into an even larger scale study that will require the enrollment of more subjects to gather further information about safety and efficacy of your product. You may engage in phase 4 of your study. This will occur after FDA approval of your product. It is intended to continue to monitor the effects of the drug or device once it is out on the market and regularly used. One reason a phase 4 trial is conducted is to further examine whether the use of the product results in side effects for some users. Devices. It is important to understand that clinical trials for medical devices are slightly different than those conducted for drugs. With devices, you will need to determine which class your medical device falls into, class 1, 2, or 3. Class 1 medical devices do not need clinical trials to support their pre-market applications because nearly all are exempt from pre-market review. However, Class 1 manufacturers may wish to conduct clinical trials to gather data to support marketing claims they intend to make. If such trials are getting at safety or effectiveness, then they would require all human subject protections, though not an investigational device exemption, as the devices are able to go directly to market. If a Class 1 device were intended for a different indication, then safety and effectiveness trials to support an application might require an investigational device exemption. About 10 to 15% of Class 2 510K devices require clinical data to support clearance, and Class 3 PMA devices require clinical studies. Request for approval from the FDA will generally go through a pre-submission process that involves device design, bench testing, and animal testing, followed by an investigational device exemption application submitted to the FDA requesting approval for your clinical trial. You will request pre-market approval and then potentially request approval for device changes or upgrades, which may require a new investigational device exemption application. This concludes our introduction into clinical trials, and we hope you will join us for our next video, where we will provide an overview of the product's liability implications of clinical trials. It is important to understand that your exposure to risk and therefore the necessary insurance coverage you may need will change based on 1, whether you are dealing with a drug, device, or biologic. 2, the current stage of your clinical trial. 3, the nature of the illness being treated by your product. And 4, the age and other characteristics of your study population. That concludes our video for today.